Today's our panel discussion. We're going to go through a couple of questions that we've thought up in advance to give something to talk about. So I will go through about 4 of those questions, and each of the panel members will get a chance to say something about that particular topic. And please do chip in through the chat window if there are things that you'd like to ask or more questions you'd like to pose, and we will try and pick them up as we go. So let's start with the first question, which is a kind of general one about whether the examples that were talked about on Wednesday, how they relate to the QA framework, which I introduced on the day before, Tuesday. And so I thought it would be useful to do that using one of the whiteboards that we've got as a little activity, and ask people in turn to say how their particular MOOC that they were thinking of would fit into that framework, and maybe just pick 1 or 2 of the categories rather than all of them. So if I switch to the whiteboard, let's see, pick the right one. Sorry, that was the one I wanted to start with. So these are some of the benchmarks from OpenupEd, and I was going to ask our panel members if they'd like to say something about a particular MOOC and 1 or 2 of these particular benchmarks. Tiberio, you're on screen. Can I hand over to you to say where you position yourselves on that whiteboard? So Tiberio, can you like to comment on that? Tiberio, I can't hear you, so I'm not sure if your microphone is turned on.
No, okay. It's better if it works better if you open your micro. Good afternoon, everybody. Well, I think in general or about my intervention only, are you asking? I have no tools to write. I don't know if somebody has to. I see here. Okay, that's right. Are you asking, John? Are you asking about my presentation or about all of them?
I was thinking about an example MOOC that had a lot of gamification in. So if you have a view on how gamification would fit to those benchmarks particularly.
Okay. I think usually in MOOCs, about my MOOC experience, I think there are clear outcomes usually for me. So I think there is also alignment among the learning outputs, the contents, and the assessment, because, for instance, usually questions are about contents, and contents are in videos or text. So I think there is alignment. It's not so clear that the activity is construct for me. Okay, so I'm putting my mark in the middle. Sometimes there is, but sometimes it's not clear. And there is a reason. I think the reason is the scalability. There is a big problem. Usually we're designing, we are thinking about a lot of students, a lot of learners. And so we use usually very transmissive didactics of methodologies. And about relevant, accurate, and current, I think it's also difficult. It depends. But as I see, in general, MOOCs are very basic level, very basic contents. It's not deep content in general, I think. And the interactivity or active learning is also quite few. I think I'm marking there are some activities. Sometimes you have a forum, sometimes you have activities in social media, for instance, in Twitter and so on. But by the same reason, I think there is less interactivity or active learning as in other courses. And the assessment, I think there is assessment, but it's not formative. Or it's less formative as summative. I think there is more summative assessment, for instance, a test, a final test, or some kind of automatical test, instead formative. For me, formative is continuous assessment, and for the same reason, I think there is less. So I'm also marking here, okay?
That's great, Tavario. If you introduced a lot more gamification into a MOOC, would you see any of those change?
For me, the change is basically in the didactics model. That means in interactivity, active learning, okay, self-assessment, and activities construct learning. It's very similar for me. That is the learning model of activities, basically, and related to the assessment, because I think also we are, according the kind of assessment we are offering, we are promoting some kinds of learning or not, okay? Related to the kind of the type of assessment we are promoting.
Okay, thank you very much. Dario, I can see you in the list there. I wondered if you'd like to make any comments.
Hi. More or less, I agree with Tiberio. Regarding learning outcomes, I agree that in general they are very well defined. Usually there is a good alignment between outcomes and learning objects. Contents are well defined. There is well-defined assessment procedure. About activities construct learning, I don't know. I don't feel able to provide a real answer here. About point relevant, accurate, current, I agree that with Tiberio that usually MOOCs cover just general topics, but it depends how the level of accuracy that you put inside the MOOC design, and also probably the involvement of external stakeholder in MOOC design. So I would like to put a higher level. Interactivity, active learning, self-assessment. According to my experiences, again, I agree with Tiberio. It depends by the MOOC. we have different experiences. In general, the level of interactivity is low. Also because in most of cases the activity, there is no tutor or very small tutoring. However, we are trying to integrate in our projects some asynchronous interactive tools such as forum or synchronous interactive tools such as webinars. We are including virtual or remote labs, and all these activities should increase the level of interactivity and active learning for the students. It's quite challenging to, much more challenging to include a virtual or remote lab in a MOOC than just designing the MOOC contents. But the students appreciate it a lot. So here I would like to say, depends. Regarding formative and summative assessment, well, again, generally we have a general assessment, not really a continuous assessment. Also, this is again related to the lack of a massive tutoring. What I will say, probably, I would say, less, yes. For me, there is a lack of the assessment of the impact of the MOOC after its end, because usually the assessment is just related to the activity of the MOOC itself, but usually there isn't at all any assessment of the potential benefits of the MOOCs on the learner after the ends of the delivery period. So a long-term assessment is generally missing.
That's great. That's very interesting. In fact, that last one is a particular issue about how you evaluate the impact of a MOOC, the learning gains of a learner and so on, which isn't really reflected in these benchmarks. I think that sort of reflection back on the success of the MOOC. And particularly, it's quite difficult to get that in the right terms, which makes sense for individual learners. Dario, I was going to ask you one more thing. You mentioned producing a MOOC based on problem-based learning, which you thought was innovative and something different. And I was wondering again if you think that that would change the positioning on these benchmarks.
Well, for sure, project-based learning is considering a high interactive methodology, because behind self-assessment, you have to put students all together, you present something, and they have to work together in order to find the solution. So exactly the opposite of passive learning methodology. If there is no interaction, there is no final result. However, indeed, we are studying if and how it's possible to integrate this methodology into an e-learning environment. We have tried to solve with forum. We are making some tests with in the project, but I'm not sure that the result will be successful. And also discussing with a lot of colleagues also from other universities, they have no experience. So Differently from the other project, I would like to say that here is something that we are experimenting, and I'm not sure about the result. For sure, if the experiment will be successful, it will be a very interesting experience, because you will have a very high interactive model of MOOC. But in this case, you need a higher motivation of students and probably also a higher availability of time. So it will be an interesting experience for us.
Yes, yes. And I'm sure that would probably put students very high on this activities construct learning as well.
Mm-hmm.
Be interesting. Right, I think we should ask for comments from other participants, but I can't see anything happening in the chat window. I'd just like to ask Lizzie to check that I'm seeing the chat window correctly, whether anything's coming in that I'm not aware of.
Is everyone able to use the chat? I'm just going to ask. Nothing's happening, then we know that it's not working.
Yes, if you could at least say that. Yes.
Then at least it works. Okay, perfect.
Okay, so do we have any questions that anyone would like to pick up from what we've discussed up to now? If not, we'll move on to another question. Let's just take a second to see if anyone has a burning question that they'd like to ask. No, I can't see anything coming in. In which case, I think we'll move on to another question then, and just hope I can find the right PowerPoint. There we are. Let's move on to the next question, which is about the role of external stakeholders in the MOOC design process. I think, Dario, you would probably be best placed to talk about this one. So can I hand over to you for a minute and talk a bit about this topic?
This topic is relevant for me, considering that all the projects that I presented and so all the MOOCs that I am considering are based on digital skills, and so here it's very, I mean, we are talking of contents that are not well established. In some cases, the contents may change after 6 months. So it's very important to listen external stakeholder and to monitor the trend of the technologies in order to design some courses that are not updated. However, one more point is that usually the universities an approach in content design that sometimes is different from the point of view of the business sector. And so, if you are to realize some MOOCs that are oriented for the business to the business sector, I mean, oriented not to traditional students, but from people coming from the business sector that have to be retrained and then go back in the business sector to bring inside such competencies, it's very important to take into account their point of view. On the other hand, it's always an open issue. Sometimes the business sector has a very practical point of view that is based just on the quick acquisition of competencies, for example, without taking into consideration all the theoretical aspects that can be behind some technologies or methodologies. So, according to my experience, if you work on, in particular, on MOOCs related to technological aspects, it's very important to have an involvement of external stakeholders in the MOOC design process. In all our projects, in the partnership, we have a balance of partners coming from universities and coming from the business sector in order to have a joint design phase. And however, each project starts with an assessment of the state of art, so submitting a survey to a good group of external stakeholders in order to really understand their needs and their interests. Then, of course, you reach one point where the competencies and knowledge of the universities in the content design are essential, because you practically see that companies will not be able to, even if they know what they need, they will not be able to design contents by themselves. So always my suggestion is a good balance between academia and business. But this is my experience, and if there are any more experience, I will be really interested to listen to them.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Dario. Tiberio, would you like to comment at all on this question?
Yes, I will. I agree with Dario. I think companies have brings also, and in general, external stakeholders bring their experience in training, in continuous training, in designing from another point of view. They also bring their competence. In general, they are very competent in their sector, they focus very well their needs, and they understand very well what their workers or what their clients need. It's also a good opportunity to transfer from, in our case, private sector to public sector, or from industry to academic sector. And it's also, I think, they bring or they contribute with their professionalism. In general, they reflect a specialist, their speciality or their knowledge in some kind of sector. And so I think also it's the external stakeholders in general are good partners with academic ones. I agree with Dario.
One thing that was occurring to me is whether it helps students in terms of recognition and value of a MOOC, if it's clear that it has a strong external stakeholder engagement, maybe from business or particular companies. And so whether making that very visible to students is important or not. Would anyone like to comment on that? No, I don't think anyone's commenting on that. It's an issue which I think helps with the idea of recognition of the MOOC if it's clear that a course has been produced in combination with representatives from industry or something like that. because at the end of the day, why are students taking MOOCs? And to get recognition for their work presumably helps if it's aligned to some industry or commercial purposes. So do we have any reaction?
Excuse me.
Yeah, sure.
I think this kind of recognition is good in both senses. But that means for a worker, it's good to have some kind of certificate from the university. But in some sectors, it could be in the other sense also. For instance, for a student or for a learner, it could be good also some kind of certificate from some companies as Google, as Microsoft, and so on. So this kind of certification is good in both senses, I think, not only from university to companies, also sometimes from companies to university.
Yes, I agree. I think that's very important. So again, I can ask if anyone participating has any comment. If you'd like to put it in the chat window, please do. Otherwise, we can move on yet again.
Sorry, just one more comment about recognition of MOOCs. There are different policies at European level. For example, the EQUET model for the design recognition of the vocational training courses that are long, sometimes boring process needed to describe in detail all the to design some qualification and describe them, but it's a tool that is useful to design some qualification that can be awarded to the learners, and so could facilitate the recognition of the MOOCs that they have attended. There are other different methodologies. For example, in the last year, the open badges is going to be quite popular at European level. However, even if it takes more time, my suggestion would be anytime that a MOOC is designed to take care of the recognition of the competencies, trying to associate to the MOOC methodology for the recognition and transfer of competencies. That could be open badges, EQUET, e-competence framework, or I don't know. Otherwise, there is the risk that the recognition of competencies is just based on the reputation of the course. For example, I'm attending a course from Microsoft and it's recognized just because it's Microsoft. But this is fine for just for well-known providers or for well-known courses. It doesn't work for a new course. So for a new course, trying to think to recognition policies, it's a good idea in general.
Okay, thanks, Dario. Yes, that's an important point, isn't it? It sounds as though it's quite hard work, but worth doing. Okay, I can't see any questions coming in on the chat, so in which case maybe we should move on to a different question and have a go at that one. So let's move on to the next question, which is about gamification again, so which I mentioned briefly. So can I turn to Tiberio then to introduce this one and ask what are the opportunities for gamification in MOOCs?
Okay, I have some slides, and I'm to explain quickly some ideas. I'm talking the opportunities on 3 levels: macro level, meso level, and micro level. In macro level, we are thinking about stakeholders of international institutions. In meso level, we are talking about higher education institutions as universities or companies. And in micro level, focusing only the specific MOOCs. So, in macro level, I think is a good gamification is a good strategy for management, for marketing, for offering openness, contacting to institutions, to stakeholders, and so on, and transferring the models of the strategies from one sector to another one, as we were talking about. In meso level, inside our institutions, inside universities, inside higher education institutions, I think it's a gamification also gives us opportunities for management to promote the ideas among teachers, among students inside these institutions, to promote also innovation, and to transfer models and strategies, ideas from one team, from another team, from one teacher to another teacher, etc., from one sector and to other sectors. However, I think that in micro level, that means when we are designing specific MOOC, it's when we have much more opportunities applying gamification. So, as we were talking about yesterday, considering the application at the whole course, designing the course as a game, or for instance, PBL is a good strategy in this sense, simulation and so on as a whole course, or also as specific actions of elements inside the course. Changing or applying gamifications to goals, to contents, to activities, to methodology, to interaction, assessment, and so on. I think gamification could be applied in every element of the course design. And so also some ideas about the benefits and also the difficulties when we are talking about gamification in micro level. Generally, we think only about benefits because we motivate, we engage. It's a good. We are making a better, a nicer experience. I think we promote also the permanence. We avoid the dropout of students, and it's a way to increase also the activity, the participation of learners, and so to have also a better experience, so to increasing satisfaction, okay? And as teachers, I think we are interested on increasing satisfaction, okay? But I recognize also that there are some difficulties. For instance, I'm talking about only 2 ideas. One is the workload. I think when we are doing a better didactics, better methodology, better activities means also much more workload, and mainly for teachers in designing, but also in carrying out the course. It's much more work for us. And also sometimes in some academic contexts, it could be also some kind of frivolity. It's not serious, it's for children and so on. Sometimes you have to listen to this kind of asserts. And so I think we have also to be very careful using games and gamification. Because I know sometimes, not only in teachers, in colleagues, but also in students, in learners, and sometimes they react negatively when you use games or gamification. Okay? These are only some ideas to discuss about.
That's great. That's an interesting list of benefits and difficulties that you've got there. Again, I'm trying to encourage people to contribute through the chat. So if anyone has reactions to what Taveria has just said, then please do share them. Whether you think gamification is a good idea, worth exploring, or something risky about it. Can I pick up one thing, which is when you mentioned workload, I was wondering whether it had an impact on the student workload, on the time that a student might take in order to sort of cover the same ground through the use of gamification rather than more traditional didactics. So we have a couple of questions. Let's just read one of them out. Is there a risk that gamification could reduce the abundance of information that should be delivered to students? In other words, if you spend too much time playing, you don't cover as much ground, maybe. Taveria, would you have a reaction?
It depends on how you are using gamification. But in general, my experience as teacher, I prefer very few ideas, very clear, very engaging contents or activities, very few ones, instead a lot of ones with a transmitting methodology. In general, when you only offer contents, for instance, in videos or in text, the learning depends on the interest, the motivation of learners. But when there is motivation or learners' motivation, you don't need teacher really. So when we are proposing or offering gamification, that means we want that teachers have an active role, also promoting, motivating, engaging students. Okay, because if the learners or the students had already, before starting, they had motivation, really nowadays we don't need teachers, because we have a lot of information, data and resources in the internet. And so everybody could, if somebody is motivated about a topic, really he or she doesn't need any teachers, because this is the self-didactics, the autodidactics. So we are starting thinking that the teachers, we could contribute, motivating and engaging. And in general, I don't know yours or of John or of Dario, my experience is it's better. Very few activities or contents, but very motivating, engaging instance, because if you want much more contents, you have a lot of ones and a lot of data, a lot of books and so on in the internet. This is my opinion.
Okay, that's a good point. Dario, do you have a comment? There's a comment about simulation, particularly. I wondered if does that relate at all to your virtual environments that you've talked about?
Well, Gamification in general is a topic that I love, but unfortunately I don't have a relevant real experience about that. Also because in practice I'm professor of electrical engineering, and I have still found a really practical solution to involve gamification into my courses, or in general in some MOOC-based project that we have designed. We had just an experience of gamification that can partially considered as gamification, realized by a group of my students that basically realized an hardware for the analysis of simple electric circuits connected to an app that they have realized that was connected to one of my courses. And the idea was to produce a simple, game-based and safe way to learn something about electric circuits. So there was a large board and some bricks with electric components, so it was like a game, but it was connected to this app in order to test the result. And it was very nice because students appreciated it much more than working on simulators or just working on exercises, because just the possibility to touch something or the interaction with the app increased a lot the engagement. But I understand that it's something hardware based, so it's not fully integrated in an online environment. So this is not the final goal I would like to reach. So gamification in general is something that I would like to experience in the next years, but unfortunately I still don't have a concrete example to show.
Sounds an interesting example anyway. I was wondering about whether some of the more collaborative activities that you might set up in a MOOC would verge into gamification. For example, if you ask people to role play or to carry out some activity where they do take on different roles during that activity, would we see that as part of gamification? Because they are given different tasks, and maybe you could set the thing up so that different teams are sort of working in some slight competition or something. Would that count as gamification?
Well, I forward the question to Tiberio, asking what is the barrier between gamification and serious game?
According to the teaching model, we have explained yesterday, a serious game is a whole methodology. That means the whole course is as a game. For instance, it's a PBL or a simulation, okay? Or you are simulating, for instance, with teachers that there is a school and we are the teachers' team and we have to design, to organize, and so on, okay? So this is a whole point of view of the course. And when we talk about gamification, we are focusing on some kind of elements, some kind of activities, some kind of techniques. That means this is a difference between method and technique. The method is the whole point of view, and the technique is a specific, a particular contribution as an activity, as a content, and so on. You know, it could be an explanation, but I know in the literacy in general, in publications, we use serious game as gamification and gamification also as serious games. Okay, after one thing is the concepts, the conception, the theoretical conception, and in the other hand, there is a reality, and among teachers, among magazines, in publications, in books, and so on. Sometimes it's confusing, but we could differentiate it. We could differentiate between a whole point of view as a method, as a serious game, or as specific activities, strategies, techniques, and it would better talking about gamification.
Okay, so I have seen more experiences of serious game than gamification, according to such definition. And I think that probably you have to make a distinction. You have to use one instead of another, also taking into account the target groups, and so also the age and the expectation of the participants in MOOC. Probably tell me if I'm wrong, but probably more gamification would be more oriented for younger participants. Instead, if I'm thinking about professionals that have to be retrained, I should think about serious game.
It's true that it's related to the field or the sector we are teaching or we are learning. For instance, I think in health field, in health, in engineering, in psychologists, in pedagogues, in teaching, there are some sectors, but it's easier, by my experience, it's easier to carry out some kind of gamification. And in others one, it's more complex, but it's normal, because if I have done a course, a MOOC 1 year ago about the diff and the dual and so on. So with some topics, it's very difficult to carry out explicit gamification. But for this, it's not automatical. I think you have to think about, you have to analyze, you have to discuss with your team, and to decide which kind of gamification, which kind of techniques or strategies and so on, in which contexts and in which contexts not, and so on. It's not automatic. It's not so easy.
I've noticed in the comments, been a couple of comments about motivation, and motivation is the first one on your list of benefits of motivation and engagement. So do you think that is really the prime reason for wanting to go for gamification approaches?
In my case, it is, because but not only in MOOCs, also in degrees, in post-degrees, and so on. Because in my methodology, in my didactics, I use a lot of online resources as web conferences. And so for me, it's very important to keep and to receive good sensations, good answers, good reactions from students, okay? So it's as when we are face-to-face with students. And so gamification for me, it's directly connected or related to the feeling of students, the experience of students. And so, for me as teacher, it's very important to perceive this kind of motivation. Okay, they are going on, they are interested on the topic, and so on. So this is the reason for me motivation is the first part. And I know that motivation has also some impacts on the permanence of the engagement, the satisfaction, and so on.
And can I ask a little bit more then? Is what particular elements of gamification do you think help with that motivation? Is it the challenge of trying to improve, trying to do better than you did the time before, trying to do better than somebody else? Or is it the immediate feedback of wanting to get things in a quick cycle, which you get, you know, for example, playing an arcade game? Is it those sorts of things that you're looking for when you do gamification?
Usually I don't use competition, so it's not winning. Winning is not a motivation for me, nor in my strategies. But sometimes it's only the activity. Sometimes changing the role, the learner's, the student's role, from a passive one to an active one is sufficient to increase motivation, only because they are in distance education, there are a very large tradition of a passive role in students. Okay, I was distance education student, and my role was only reading, studying, assessment, and so on, no more. So it's a very passive role. So sometimes just with a more active role, you are motivating students, giving them the opportunity to value, to give their opinions, to share their experience, because in distance education, usually our students are older than in face-to-face education. My students have an average of 36 years old, okay? So they are older than the face-to-face traditional students, okay? So sometimes only changing the role of students, you are increasing motivation. And for me, it's very important, and I don't need competition. We could add also competitions among teams, among students, but instead, without competition, you could motivate a lot with participation, with values, with giving them some space to carry out their way, their own way. They perceive the reality of the topic.
Okay, that's really interesting. Is there anything else that we'd like to say, particularly about gamification, or should we? We're actually reaching the hour that the slot was for, so let's ask if there are any more general questions that people would like to pick up, moving on from gamification. I can see there is one already in the chat, which is a more general question from Erdal, I think. Is it possible to use log data of users in order to figure out learning analytics of participants in MOOCs? Do you support the use of log data of users to measure their engagement or activities on MOOCs? I think that there is a general answer, which I think a lot of MOOC platforms will give you that sort of learning analytics data, and it is used, I think, generally across platforms to look at, not necessarily from the point of view of individual learners, but certainly to look at components into course to see which are used, if there are snagging points where people get into difficulties and so on. Can I ask our two panelists if they have any comments on that? Maybe Dario, do you have any comment on using analytics and logging data?
The answer for us is in general yes, but the open issue is the level of analytics. In general, as Nettuno, we are working on this topic. If you actually, what we have is to use the data log just for an analysis ex post of the students' activities. I mean, in order to admit students to the exam or to award qualification, we have some specific requirements on the students' activities, or the number of materials that they have to study, and so on. And our platform provides all these statistics. We are making in the MOOCs with virtual remote labs also some statistics on the use of such a tool, trying to make some correlation between the use of virtual remote labs and students' performances, in order to make differences between students that study just theoretical contents and ones that use also practical tools. What is still missing is a real learning analytics tool that is able to, in such a way, some big data analysis, so grouping all the data and trying to extract some tendencies or some correlations between the students' activities and specific performances, or the students' habits, or the students' good practices. So we use log data also in our MOOCs, but just for assessing students' performances, not for more general cross-correlation studies.
Thank you. Tiberio, would you like to comment at all?
In my case, I don't use analytics nor learning analytics, because our way to assess is based on face-to-face exams, and also on formative assessment inside the forum, okay? And so we don't use learning analytics, but I know that the analysis of big data is nowadays it's much better. And so I think we could also extract interesting or meaningful information to understand better how our students are learning, and when they are more motivated or not, which are the best resources, which are the best activities, and so on. So I think in future we will have to study and to analyze this kind of data, but at this moment we don't use them.
Okay, clearly a lot of potential, but perhaps not so easy at the moment always to get the information out. I have one particular experience where I thought we were getting good data from the logs. It turned out it wasn't actually being recorded at a fine enough level to answer the questions that we wanted to. So, you know, to make really good use of log data, you have to be logging the things you're actually interested in, and that's not always easy to predict before you start.